Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode concludes our conversation with Audrey Osler, Professor Emerita of Citizenship and Human Rights Education at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom and Editor-in-Chief of Human Rights Education Review. Audrey discusses the role which human rights education can play in addressing the pressing needs of global migrants, the relationship between social justice and human rights education, how human rights education can confront rising authoritarianism across the globe, as well as serious threats to human rights in the United States. She concludes with recommendations for expanding and strengthening the field of human rights education in the future. So I want to shift over to the other book you wrote a few years ago, which deals with human rights in schooling. And you mentioned the second half of the title, which I thought was fascinating, an ethical framework of teaching for social justice. Now, that book lays out, I think, a very coherent approach. However, given all the proposals you make in that book and the ideas you have, what do you see as the most serious impediments to trying to put your ideas into practice?
Well, that book was written specifically for a US audience. And I was told when you send your proposal in and it gets reviewed, and the reviewers said, it was obvious that it was for a publisher that doesn't normally publish non-US authors. And the majority of people, the majority of people who write for Teachers College Press are US based. And so that kind of that was a challenge for me, because it almost paralyzed me in writing. What was this imaginary US audience? I'd always thought I wrote for an international audience. So I had to actually kind of construct a friend and put him at the center and then write for him, if you like. But the biggest impediment is going to vary according to the place, I'm sure. If we were thinking about human rights education within the United States, it's really, really, I'm probably heading into deep water to anticipate the impediment from outside, but it's probably the same impediment as in other places, perhaps more acute, which is recognizing children as full citizens and recognizing children as our co-citizens. And I think that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, its biggest impact across the rest of the globe, has been a re-examination of what childhood is. And I think that area of education has probably been less developed within the United States. So I'm not saying that people who are working in early childhood education aren't doing a good job, but I'm saying that within social policy, we haven't really thought about questions about prisons and children, for example, how teachers and children relate to each other as fellow citizens rather than as teacher and learner. I think those kinds of questions can be a huge impediment to recognition of children's rights.
Of course, the
And
U.S. is
just
the
because,
only UN member state that still hasn't ratified the CRC. And I think, from at least from my experience, um, there's not very much discussion about it outside of the human rights education community. You won't find any discussion of it in the New York Times or the Washington Post and things like that. And I wanted to ask you very specifically, though, about the actual public dialogue about human rights, because one of my real concerns in the US has been the lack of even the use of the term human rights. Bernie Sanders made a real important contribution when he talked about healthcare as human right, but hardly
mm,
any politician in this country of any substance or standing uses the phrase. So how do you see that sort of dialogue as an impediment or lack of dialogue?
well, it may have something to do with human rights seen as something imposed from outside. But I think that within the United States, many groups fighting for their rights have used the term. So, I found examples when I was preparing that book of people campaigning for housing, equal housing rights, who'd use the term. I think that sexual minorities have used the term human rights. So it's those whose humanity has been most challenged, I think, who have used the term. Malcolm X used the term human rights. So he was obviously campaigning for civil rights for African Americans. So I think it may be a question of who's in power, and that when we assume that we're in the majority, we don't have to worry about our humanity, so it goes unquestioned. But when you're on the margins, you have to fight to establish your fellow, your recognition. So we need to educate our journalists better as well. I think that's been very, very clear to me in the current war in Gaza. That when I listen to journalists, they're unfamiliar with what the rules of humanitarian law are as applied to civilians and so on. So I don't think it's really difficult. I think if the term isn't used, that's not a reason not to keep. It's no reason to abandon the term. And if the term is seen as, well, I think in the United States also, it's one of the countries that uses the term most commonly in its foreign policy. So I think there is an issue about, these others need human rights, and we know we're there. And I think it's about the indivisibility of rights, educating people to understand that you can't have political rights if you don't have basic social rights. If you're on the street, you can't claim your right to vote, or your right to participate in decision making. So it's seeing the relationship between the two, and I think in the United States, it's probably a classic example or an extreme example of where the two rights, social, economic, cultural, and political, have become so separated from each other. But I mean, it's the same question in the Nordic region, where everything is, a country like Norway, its whole reputation in the world depends on its human rights practice, and it's a tiny country. It's wealthy, yes, but its international influence is all on that human rights image, and they have to take trouble not to avoid tarnishing that international image. But excuse me, I'll have to cut this. I think that there is a Nordic exceptionalism too. So we are human rights, therefore we don't need to teach it in schools, because it's our national values. And the national values are very close to human rights values, but they're not the same And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't explore where the connection is between our national values and other people's national values, and who's included and who gets excluded. So these questions of exceptionalism is what I think you're raising about the US. And it's not the only country that's suffering from this exceptionalism item that exists in other places in different forms. In the UK, it's like human rights are foreign. Our government is saying, well, if we don't conform to international law, then if Rwanda, for example, is judged to be by international standards unsafe, then we're just going to pass a law in Parliament that says it's safe. I mean, this is so crazy but it's hardly discussed. It's only discussed in terms of, oh dear, the Conservatives are under threat, or the party looks divided. There's not a deep discussion about, is it reasonable to pass a law saying what's true is not true? So that's the thing I think we have to worry about.
Right, and I think you've put your finger on this idea of exceptionalism, which of course is developed through education and socialization. So, this idea that human rights education can challenge that, which sort of comes across to me as counter-socializing the mainstream narrative.
Absolutely. And what we have to remember, I think, is that education is so national. Even in a country like the United States, where people will tell you, oh, no, we don't have a national curriculum, Audrey. We have a state curriculum. Yes, but it is so national everywhere in the world. And it's because mass education, as John Dewey recognized, was introduced at a time when nationalism was at its height in the late 19th century. And we haven't thought that maybe an international curriculum, an international perspective actually might liberate us. It's only privileged kids who get an international education, who do the international baccalaureate. The less privileged are all forced through this rather narrow national education, and the privileged too. But there are certain groups who can opt out of it and study for these international exams. But yeah, we need to discuss how nationally minded we are and how that inhibits our freedom, actually, our creativity. I mean, it would be like saying, Bill, your main identity is as an American, and my main identity is British, and there's nothing more about us than those two identities. We all know, every individual knows they've got many identities. So let's start with having an education that extends those identities rather than shrinks them into a narrow nationalist box. And that's not to say that we can't be proud of our nation if we want to be, but what does proud mean? I think the idea of loving your nation is a very common one in the United States, and yes, you love your country, but if you really love your country, you love it enough to want to improve it. And so that seems to be the key to what the nation is, wanting to improve the nation rather than saying the nation is fine, we don't discuss that. That's the one subject we never talk about. So I think we're probably drifting a little bit from human rights education, but also identifying what hinders human rights education, because human rights education has got to be recognizing our common humanity. Yeah, that's why I think human rights educators are in trouble, really, when they're in trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's also viewed as a threat to power structures. And, a lot of people don't even think about the fact that 500 years ago, the idea of the nation state was a brand new idea. So when you mentioned before the idea of multi-racial, multi-ethnic groups living in the same city, this was commonplace. The idea that they identified with the nation was a foreign idea. So I think you're right. I mean, the whole idea of looking at this as a way to human rights education as a way to sort of examine the universal dimensions of human experience would be a much more positive dimension. So that sort of leads me into our last few questions here. So now today, as you well have already commented, there are some very serious threats politically, authoritarian regimes in Russia, Hungary, Venezuela. We have our own emergent authoritarianism in the United States. How do you see human rights education dealing with that threat?
Yeah, it's like the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think first of all, we need to remind ourselves that education can't do everything on its own, and that if we want to challenge these threats, we need to challenge them through other activities as well as through education. So, education cannot. I'll start again. Education cannot prevent war. Education cannot, in its own right, prevent authoritarianism. What education can do is to enable individuals and groups to recognize that there are other ways of doing things. So, I don't think authoritarianism can be challenged exclusively through education. I think we have to look at the underpinning structures, like how far have we allowed these authoritarian leaders to take positions? How do we what is going on when issues like abortion or pulling down statues or any other, or arguing that empire was a good thing or a bad thing, or we should measure it up on a balance sheet? What is going on? These people are not concerned just with that one issue. There's a whole host of things going behind it. And I guess we need to teach more about power and to think about what power means and what democracy means, because I don't think we have very many serious conversations, not with children. They get told, well, this is a democratic structure. We've got one in our country. This is how it works. Without really thinking to whose benefit, to whose loss. We need to think about the economics of it. I remember going to a meeting in Seattle once, discuss how education might be improved. And I was getting really fed up of hearing all this stuff in this meeting. And I put my hand up and said, well, it would be a great help if you paid more taxes. Because education seemed to be seriously underfunded. And there were people kind of staring at this woman with a strange accent. Then somebody said very helpfully, oh, don't worry, Audrey comes from Europe. And then that was kind of closed, as a topic. So they were really trying to be creative about how to improve schools, but they hadn't really thought, well, maybe we need to invest more in our schools, or to make sure that they're more, the money is more fairly distributed, which was really what the whole question was about. So we kind of label, oh, we've got a socialist in our midst, or something like that, or a communist, or whatever they thought I was. And it just doesn't make sense. So I don't think that there's one answer to authoritarianism, except that probably we have to be careful we don't self-censor too much, that we actually do speak out against injustices and at an early stage, rather than wait until a group has got a hold on power, or a particular political party has been claimed by an extreme group. And we're seeing that kind of thing happening again and again and again, and we've seen it in history. And there's usually a good, when I say good, a good reason, by which I mean an explanation. So, the rise of the Nazis in 1930s Europe didn't happen by chance. It happened by small steps. So it's actually speaking out at the early stages. And I do think that public discussion has become, on the one hand, people are shouting, yes, we must have freedom of speech. On the other hand, I think people avoid conflict until it's too late. So I think probably we have to explore standing up for what we believe in at an early stage with authoritarians. And I don't think it always goes in one direction. So I think sometimes we can look to examples in the world where it shifted and learn from those.
Well, Paul Robeson, the famous artist and scholar, activist, also an alumnus of Rutgers, along with me, he said, the way to end injustice is not to silence the critic, but to end the injustice.
Absolutely.
So here we have this whole, as you mentioned, this whole question of what it means to actually raise voices. And in my view, one of the other issues is the fascination with spectacle rather than substance. So that's another dimension. That's a topic for another conversation, I think. But so let me transit. Go ahead. You were going to say.
I was going to say, and the other thing is the fascination with personality that goes along with spectacle. So we people are attracted to charismatic leaders or apparently charismatic leaders. So when we have a political debate, it's about almost like how they look and how they dress and how they conduct themselves, and what they stand for gets hidden.
Exactly. So just to conclude our conversation, I have the same three questions I ask of every interviewee. So let's start. The most influential role model for your work in human rights education?
Yeah, I really struggled with this one, and I decided I have to settle for my mother. I think that because she's always encouraged me to stand up for what's right and what's wrong, but I often worried that I've had a kind of overdeveloped sense of justice. And somebody told me that's impossible, Audrey. You can't have an overdeveloped sense of justice. But sometimes I battle against things that are probably not good causes. It's directing your attention to what can be done in the moment. And my mother always told me, have these big plans in mind, always have these big plans in mind, and celebrate the small steps towards them. So I think that is something I've been really slow in learning, and I should have learned several decades ago. So that's one reason why she's a model to me.
And what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Really difficult one, this one. So I could have picked any number of people, and probably Paul Robeson that you've just mentioned said some very wise things, and he's always been a great hero, not just as an activist but also as a fabulous singer and actor. But I like this one by Angela Davis. She said, I am no longer accepting the things I can't change. I am changing the things I can't accept.
I think that says a lot. And last but not least, you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education. What would you do?
This is one that I would really, really struggle. I think it's almost like the magic wand question. I remember when my nephew was very young, and asked him what he'd like for Christmas. He said a magic wand, and then you can have anything you want. I think it's really, really hard to pick one thing. But I think if I had the magical power to remind governments that they had to abide by their international agreements, that would go a long way to resolving human rights and would thereby improve the case for all of us for human rights education. And also, we shouldn't forget that one of the guarantees we have by our governments, in both in the Universal Declaration, in the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is the right to human rights education. So I would insist that if my magic wand would go around insisting that everybody talked about the right to human rights education rather than it being some elusive thing that some vague notion by these eccentric odd people, educationalists. It would be, this isn't something which is special. This isn't something which is exceptional. This is a basic right, the right to a human rights education. I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
I think you did wonderfully. And I wanted to say this has been a very, very special interview for me. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking. I always talk too much, but it's been fun talking. Yeah, I would just say that what I've learned from this is that when I'm being interviewed, I need to stop and pause and listen, and that's the thing I would stress for all human rights educators. You can't always do it when you're being interviewed, but you need to spend time doing that. Thank you very much for including me.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, Pocket Casts, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.